one of the reasons why I want to talk to you is because you'd mentioned doing a lot of this to me. And I think it's really important to understand, like, from your perspective as a member of the faith community, what that means to you, both personally in the community that you serve, but also as part of what you do as a priest and with, like, I think the faith community in general, because there's a lot of people listen to our show who are religious. There's a lot who aren't, and there's a lot who have skepticism with the church, I think appropriately so. And so I think it'll be really good to kind of hear from you and get your perspective of what you're doing.
Yeah. Well, and those that have some skepticism about the church, I would probably lump me in with that as well. I think, especially when it comes to the area of substance use disorder, I think we do a lot more harm than good. And so just to kind of back up a little bit, so I began the journey down this road in seminary. When a church that I was attending, we had a member that we believed was suffering a drug overdose.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we have the AED and all the stuff in the first aid, but of course we don't have any Narcan or naloxone on hand. So it was a moment that we were caught up short. And so I discussed with the priest I was serving with sort of the whole situation. And we decided that we wanted to figure out how to get some either Narcan or naloxone for the parish. Long story short, it's really hard for the average person to just go out and get some. Especially a few years ago, it was even more difficult. And so I started trying to figure out how in the world we could get some. And we couldn't, to be quite frankly. This was in D.C. And we
not exactly your conservative bastion, right? Yeah.
No, and we couldn't secure any. And so I spoke with a classmate of mine who was also from Appalachia, who shared a similar drive. And so we went out and got trained to become naloxone trainers. And we began hosting trainings at the seminary with the blessing of the seminary after some conversations about the importance of this. And so they were supportive, and we started training clergy on the importance of keeping Narcan or naloxone on hand and how to use it. Quite frankly, it started because I was worried about, at that time, a lot of our homeless ministries, a lot of our feeding programs. I quickly shifted into the realization that it might be just as important for our youth group members or our vestry members. I was definitely guilty of sort of the stereotypes of what substance use disorder would be like.
Mm-hmm.
I have since seen the many different faces and no longer believe that you need to, that this road leads to homelessness or that sort of thing.
Right.
So we started trying to get it in every church that we could. And then that set me down this road. And that's where it began.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because it's good to understand your evolution of it, but also I think collectively the churches, at least where you were in seminary and everything like that. And so, like, fast forwarding, you're in Portsmouth, Ohio right now. I am saying that correctly, right? Portsmouth?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Cool. Want to make sure. Portsmouth, Ohio, which is one of the, if not the biggest, what's what I'm looking for, it's sort of a hot zone of the opioid epidemic right now. What's that part of your ministry? How are you incorporating what you learned, what you did at seminary in DC at VTS to what you're doing now?
So as soon as I landed here in Portsmouth, I immediately was put in contact with two individuals who helped sort of get me going here. Abby Spears with the health department at that time, and Josh Lawson with an organization called Faith and Public Life. And they both were doing a lot of the groundwork of sort of my dream of what I could do in ministry in this area. And after kind of proving myself not to be someone that was wanting to like evangelize and try to get members into the church, they began to allow me to start moving into this area. Abby specifically helps with a syringe exchange program here, helps administer that. And one of the ministries that I do is that I volunteer time there. And it's an interesting time. It's just me and the clients as they come in to exchange syringes. But it also provides sort of a touchdown. We have a lot of really interesting conversations. One of the parts of my calling that I feel compelled by is to help people realize that everyone is a beloved child of God, and that abstinence from drug use does not dictate that, and it's not a requirement.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'd worked a lot with the recovery community, and I want to be careful here because I want to celebrate the work that the recovery community does. It's amazing work. But at times I have felt a level of, in some circles, a level of judgment and stigma that I think reminded me of the theology and the side of the church that I kind of fight against.
Yeah, absolutely.
Shame and stigma, I think, are huge issues. And the church, for its part, has peddled in both of those. And so part of my harm reduction philosophy is not only with meeting people where they are with their drug use, but also reducing the harm that sort of bad theology does to people with substance use disorder, or just people that use drugs that, may not suffer from substance use disorder, but just recreationally use drugs and get stigmatized.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's super interesting. To clarify, I don't know if you mentioned this or not. You said that part of what you were doing or still are doing, you're trying to get in as many churches as possible or places of worship. Do you know how many you're in right now or how many you've affected?
In Virginia, we had, probably 40 different churches throughout. So it was Northern Virginia, so you can kind of throw in Maryland, DC, Virginia. We probably trained 40, 45 clergy.
That's great.
Now, so I'm at All Saints Episcopal Church in Portsmouth. I'm going to plug them real quick because we are a site of an initiative called Project Dawn, which is an initiative led by NIH to reach out to the 10 most, or the 10 highest overdose rate counties in the country. Scioto County, home of Portsmouth, is routinely the ranked number one in overdoses per capita. We are right now, in the past year, have surpassed our worst years. We are seeing the highest rate of lethal overdoses that we have ever seen. And I will just say from my work sort of on the underground side of this, that most of our overdoses are not being tallied. So it's as bad as it seems.
Wow.
It's even worse, yeah.
It's way worse because the truth is the true first responders to an overdose are usually people that use drugs, and they're not calling 911 or the police due to some really crummy Good Samaritan laws, which we are fighting right now to have the state look at some new Good Samaritan laws. Some counties in Ohio have a limit on how many times an EMT will reverse an overdose. So more than twice, and they just walk away. Then there's forced treatment or jail time. So possession charges, or if you do call 911, there's an obligation to seek treatment. So then we flood the treatment centers with people that don't want to be there and really aren't interested in sobriety. Overload that system, overload the prison system, and you know how it goes.
Yeah, it's crazy to hear that too. It is. I mean, that's awesome that you continue to expand. So, flipping a little bit, you mentioned this too, and Chuck did also about people being skeptical, right? Coming in and maybe having almost stereotyping you all, right? Like whenever they see you, what was the reaction to you going into your church? First off, you go into your church or going into these other churches and saying, hey, we actually should start helping these people, kind of practice what we preach type thing, right?
Yeah.
So what was the response?
Oh, well, it varies. There is certainly the sense from a lot of folks that substance use disorder is a moral failing. You didn't pray hard enough.
Yeah.
And so that's usually the first thing that we have to press up against is the idea that this isn't a moral failing. There's a lot of reasons that people suffer from substance use disorder, and to just wash it all as, you're sinful, quite frankly, I think is sinful. So then I quickly jump to two different avenues. If it's an Episcopal church, I jump straight to our Baptismal Covenant. In the Episcopal church, we hold tightly to two particular parts of our Baptismal Covenant. That we will seek to serve Christ in all people, loving our neighbors as ourselves, and that we'll strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being. Those two tend to shut everybody up. They get it really quick from them.
Very unimpeachable things.
Yeah, and that dignity part is huge. As we know, dignity is hard to come by, especially if you are an intravenous drug user. And so that is sort of at the heart of why I work at the syringe exchange, or why I give Narcan out at the church, is a moment, perhaps the only moment in that day, in that week, that the client will come up and be told, I love you. God loves you. God bless you. You're not broken. You're not damaged. You're a beloved child of God. And through that, the smile that you see in return just says, like, hey, I don't hear that enough. I mean, really, who does? Like, who really does hear, like, you're loved enough? But for the folks that I work with on a daily basis, it's rare at best. And so giving that dignity, that mutuality, like, also, like, it's kind of funny. They'll come in and say, hey, you're a priest. They assume a level of perfection from me that is incorrect. Chuck, you've known me for a long time. I've not always been a priest. And the caller doesn't necessarily say, like, hey, he behaves well all the time.
Yeah.
And so I get a chance to just kind of break the stigma of the caller a little bit too, because it comes with its own barriers. But
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And the reason I wanted to kind of touch on that, I grew up Catholic, so I don't practice anymore. But but I always felt my dad was an addict for years, right? And I tend to try not to use that word, but with him, it's so difficult not to, just because it's kind of like in my brain with him. But and he left early on in my life, but I felt like I could never talk about that in church, because every time that somebody was talking about other people having problems, there were two responses. There were, one, he just doesn't love God enough, or two, there was this kind of like pity praying party, right? Like where people kind of pity you and they're like, let's pray for you and your family, but it doesn't come off sincere. It comes off almost like, I am less than, right? And I think that is, part of the reason I wanted to talk about, and the fact that you mentioned early on, you said that part of what you should be focusing on and something that you learned is touching on the youth side of things, maybe, talking to them early on. And I find that to be extremely important. Do you use the same tactics that you do with, or do you have your own whenever it comes to talking to young people about this?
I generally, when talking with young people, that's where it gets a little tricky, because I'll maybe be a little frank and a little more honest than maybe the parents necessarily want me to be. But also, I know that that these problems can develop with youth. This isn't just a grown-up problem, and especially anymore, it seems to be younger and younger folks getting swirled up into the world of substance use disorder, especially with opioids. I know I can't count the amount of people I know that before they were adults had suffered some sort of injury and been overprescribed medication, or prescribed medication and didn't take it and then decided that they wanted to take a lot of it. And I know how that can spiral out of control. That's touched my own family system, and many of the people that I've grown up with. And so I'm pretty cut and dry with them about it. And also, if there is a hint that folks have friends who are using or are using themselves, I won't hesitate to give them their Narcan. I give it away a lot. That's the Project Dawn allows me to become a secondary distribution site for Narcan. So I have a nice supply of Narcan available at the church that I give out to all sorts of folks. So yeah, that less than part that the church can make people feel, that's sort of that, and the funerals, like really bad funerals for folks that have died of overdose or suicide, are sort of like reasons I put on the collar and fight this fight. Bad funerals of people being condemned to hell for substance use disorder.
It's awful.
Yeah. And if anybody listening out there has a friend who has died from an overdose and needs a funeral, reach out. I will try to provide a funeral with dignity and love, because too many funerals end up with some really nasty things happening.
Yeah, I mean, that's all these people, are looking for too. I mean, is this, this sense of dignity. And, the one thing I wanted to comment on, I'm sure you're already thinking of this, but the big thing that, if it's either you or, leaders in the harm reduction community or anything, going on in terms of those resources, I always think that there needs to be a focus also on the kids whose parents are going through this, right? Because we often focus on the people who are going through it, which is 100%, obviously we need to start there. But sometimes we forget about what those kids are going through. And I think that by reaching out and kind of talking to them early and really getting them to grasp the concept of, one, it's not their fault, or two, they can be helped. They're not lost forever, and I think that that's kind of sometimes what the church or even some of these groups tend to forget. And so I just wanted to add that comment, because I do think that is a really important part that sometimes gets forgotten.
Yeah, absolutely. The children involved in these systems, it's hard to wrap your head around sort of what the war on drugs, particularly from the 80s on, has done. I don't want to get up on my giant anti-war on drugs soapbox, but it's bound to happen eventually. It's destroyed the family. I mean, here at the church, we pretend to say that the family is number one, but yet we've sat back and watched families be utterly decimated by the war on drugs, especially in communities full of Black and brown bodies where we have just raided their community of every male influence they have, leaving families broken and shattered and scattered. It's I don't use the word sin very often in my ministry, but that's where it gets used right there. And what we have done to people by criminalizing drug use, criminalizing possession, abstinence only messaging that we give to these communities. It's just it's sinful.
Yeah.
I don't know what else.
Completely agree. Completely agree. It's really damaging to kids, especially who are growing up with that kind of mentality, that messaging their whole lives. Yeah.
And it's incredibly harmful. And then a lot of the churches will then, baptize you for sobriety. And then what happens when you relapsed? Has God left you? Like it just seems like we've dropped the ball. I'm constantly in shock of how poorly the church has handled care for folks with substance use disorder. We have traditionally in the Episcopal Church allowed AA and NA to take place in our church buildings, but also haven't acknowledged the fact that that's a very holy space. And there's just, quite frankly, usually a giant chasm between the folks who meet in our basements and our parish halls and the folks who meet in our sanctuaries.
Absolutely.
And that's where that dignity, that mutuality, meeting people where they are, is really important.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that what you're doing is really important because I feel like we've touched on this, but there is a stigma with the church that is earned with that. And so I'm kind of curious going forward. I mean, you do this on an individual level. What's been the reception where you are now in Southeast Ohio, with I guess it'd be the Southeast Ohio diocese or whatever diocese you're a part of? Do you feel like there's a change in tone with the church, or do you feel like anything's changing with them as far as their willingness to, I guess, for lack of a better word, be more progressive on the issue of opioids and on how we treat people with substance use disorder?
Yeah, I think I'm in the Diocese of Southern Ohio. So we encompass Columbus, Cincinnati, and Dayton, which are sort of the epicenters of population. But we also encompass the entire Appalachian section of Ohio that butts right up against West Virginia and Kentucky. And we're a progressive diocese. We have two main focuses. One, which is a racial reconciliation movement called Becoming a Beloved Community. And part of that, they have started a reparations task force. So where this kind of falls in is as framing it through the lens of the war on drugs and what's happening to our Black and brown communities. They've been willing to really look at this. We have a good social justice movement in our diocese. And so seeing harm reduction as social justice, but also with the components of race, was one of the untold things about the overdose rate is that the number one group, at least from the data that we've seen here for overdose, is Black men fresh out of prison. And so when you throw that in there, that statistic, it really reframes this whole thing.
Yeah.
And so we're getting traction. We are within the diocese. We're getting traction. And honestly, within Scioto County, within the last year, we've seen 3 new churches come on with Project Dawn. And mainly through the work of Josh Lawson, I can't say that enough because I'm riding his coattails a lot in Portsmouth. He was a former United Church of Christ pastor here who left the church right as I arrived, and I pretty much picked up the torch that he was carrying. But he has really championed the stigma reduction within the faith community here, and has done a lot of hard work. And then I have picked that up and have continued to sort of champion that. And so we're really, it's one of those things that as soon as a church really sees it, gets the blinders ripped off, they're kind of like, oh dear, how have we missed this?
Yeah. That's good to know that they at least have that realization, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the stigma thing, right? We don't want to talk about it. It's been the elephant in the room in a lot of our churches and communities for a very long time. And it affects so many of us that it's hard to look out, quite frankly, from a pulpit over any congregation and not see the stories and wonder, why in the world are we not talking about this? We've all lost someone, especially in this region. We've all lost someone, or have a son or a cousin or a nephew that's struggling. Come on, let's get rid of this shame. Let's get this out of the dark. Let's talk so we can heal, so that we can support each other.
Absolutely.
Because the shame just continues it.
Yeah, it just perpetuates it and pushes it more into the dark. Paul, I really appreciate you sharing everything with us, and this has been a really great conversation. I think it's one that I'm excited for our listeners to hear, because I think we really do need to work on shedding that stigma in so many different areas, but especially in the religious community, where, while a lot of times maybe it may be well-meaning, it isn't helping the problem. And I think what you're doing is, and it's really important. And I hope that other people can see that the church, that there are people in the church that are doing it, whether or not you find yourself to be religious, whether or not you agree with the church. There are people there like yourself that are really trying to provide a community-based way of helping people and viewing them as human beings, not as problems. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
And thanks so much for joining us.
No problem.